All right, good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study. Thank you so much for joining us. We are currently in a series called Honest to Moses. Honest to Moses. It is a quest for the historical Moses. This is class number 8. So if you're behind, you can binge this over a long weekend and get caught up. But we do have these archived not only on our Facebook page, as many of you know, but on our YouTube channel and on our website, UnitedIsraelWorldUnion.com. Long name, but it's easy to remember. It's easy to spell. So please check those previous 7 classes out if you missed them, because we've been going through systematically through the text primarily of the Pentateuch, the 5 books, and looking for what can we determine with any fair degree of certainty, indications that help us to get closer to the historical Moses. Now, today, one of the things that I want to do, I want everybody to be able to take a deep breath. We've looked at some things more from an academic standpoint, I think is the best way to categorize it. And there's nothing wrong with that. We should. We should look at things in a very textual, a very close way, and that's what we've been doing. But today, one of the things that I want to do, because I set us up for this class last week, is I want to begin to focus at times throughout this series, ever so often, on some of the key teachings that are found within the 5 books. And these key teachings, I believe, can be traced back to the historical Moses. So without further ado, I want to begin this morning in the book of Exodus, chapter 2, and we're going to pick up on something that I think is very important. In fact, I'm paving the way this morning as I move into what I think is one of the most important, significant teachings that is associated with Moses. So if you'll go with me, Exodus chapter 2, I want to read verse 21 and 22. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bore him a son. And he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. I have been a stranger in a strange land. An English reader who does not know Hebrew will think that behind the English, a stranger in a strange land, that the Hebrew in the word stranger and in strange is the same Hebrew word, but it is not. It's not. In English, strange and stranger are associated one with the other based on the element which is the basis of the word strange, stranger. Those two are connected. But in the Hebrew, we have this phrase, ki amar ger, Hayiti ba'eretz nokriah. It says, and because he said, now these are the words of Moses. If this were a red-lettered Pentateuch, this would be presented in that way. It wants you, the writer wants you to see that Moses said this. Because he said a ger. Now the Hebrew word ger, we're going to be talking about today, but I'm going to leave it untranslated at this point. He says, because I have been a ger in the land, Nokriah means foreign. So he names his son Gershom, because ger means what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to tell you at this juncture. Shom means there. He's a stranger there in this foreign land. Now look with me at Exodus chapter 18. Exodus 18 is another occurrence of this phrase by Moses. But I just want you to have these in your notes. Exodus chapter 18 and verses 2 and 3 say the following. Let's start in verse 1 of 18. When Yitro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord, or Jehovah, had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of whom the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. So here is one translation. This is the Koran text, which I tend to like best of the English translations which I use. And this particular phrase in Hebrew, it says, Ki amar ger hayiti ba'eretz nochriah. It's the same exact Hebrew phrase as we find in Exodus chapter 2. But remember, in Exodus chapter 2, in this translation, it says, For I have been a stranger in a strange land. Here, the text says, I have been an alien in a strange land. Well, what is the difference? The English translators at times are not as consistent as I would like them to be. In other words, if you pick a word, if ger means stranger, use stranger. Use it consistently. That way, the person reading the work in the language with which they are familiar makes the association that stranger is ger and ger is stranger, if that's the way you want to do it. Now, on the other hand, if you want to say that ger means alien, use alien. That way, people reading it in the language with which they are familiar will know that alien means ger and ger means alien. Now, I want to stress this going into this class today, that Moses was not a stranger in Egypt, okay? Nor was he an alien in Egypt in that sense, or he's implying at least that he is a stranger in another place. He considers himself, we're going to really unpack this morning, but he considers himself a ger in the place that we now know is the people of Midian dwell there, okay? So Egypt to Moses was his home. Now, in reality, not only Moses, but the whole of the Hebrew people were Egyptians, if you will. Now, don't get confused on me. By that, I mean to remind you that according to the biblical text, and I know that people debate, was it really 400 years? Was it about 400 years? Is the chronology messed up? Should it be rendered as 200 years? Do we begin the count in the land of Canaan? You know, I know about all those arguments, but according to the biblical text, we're looking at an extended period of time. The low side of that would be 200 plus years, and the high side would be 400. That's a long time. The people became part of the Egyptian culture in some ways. This does not mean to suggest that they didn't retain their cultural identity as Hebrews. But you might say that according to the biblical account, the people of Israel, the Hebrew people in Egypt for that period of time, could likely be considered Hebrew Egyptians. Right? Like in our culture, we might say Italian Americans or African Americans. They have that cultural identity which says, yes, we're Americans, we're part of this melting pot of people, but we also retain another identity that takes us back to our origins, right? So let's think of the people that are there that belong to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as Hebrew Egyptians. All right, I don't know that anyone else has used that phrase, but I'm using it to illustrate this point. These people are Semitic in stock, and they're dwelling in the land of Ham. They're dwelling in the land of Mitzrayim, and this, my friends, was not so uncommon. We have other records in the ancient Near East that indicate that at the time, Egypt was a major place, right? It's a major country, and there were people from all different sorts, all different backgrounds and ethnicities, and Egypt was it, right? It's one of the world powers. So, but within that larger group that we'll call Mitzrayim, or the Egyptians, there is this group. So when Moses leaves that and goes to the land of Midian, he says, I was a ger in a foreign land. It's foreign to him. Now, Egypt was not foreign to Moses. It's all he knew, and it's all the people of Israel knew. Now, last week, as I closed my teaching, I mentioned that the eldest son of Moses, because we traced that back, and we talked about the sons of Moses. But I mentioned that the eldest son of Moses has something to teach us. And I made sort of a sensational claim that Moses' son has something to teach us that is perhaps one of the greatest biblical truths when it comes to our relationship with others. That's a pretty bold claim. How in the world can I back this up? Because, let me just say it up front, there's no record of Moses' eldest son teaching anything. So, did I just pull your leg to get you to log in this week? I don't want to say it like that. What I would prefer to say is that I will now endeavor to prove and connect Moses' oldest son with one of the greatest biblical revelations that you will find within the pages of Holy Writ. Now, how can I do that? How can I possibly do that? Because my claim is based on a name. I know some of you are having flashbacks to some bad theology when I mention name and claim in the same breath. Some of you probably lived through the name it, claim it phase of your religious walk. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm doing today is I'm going to associate the name Gershom with one of the most important biblical teachings that we have. Actually, I want to do something today that's a little bit different than what we've done over the course of the last 7 classes. It is part of the same quest, as you will see. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I want to begin throughout this study, beginning today, to reach in and highlight some of those Moses' greatest hits, if you will. All right? I think that's a fair way to call it. And I think that we can, with a great degree of certainty, trace this particular teaching that I'm going to give today back to the historical Moses, at least back to ancient times. Now, among the academic world, or people in the academic world, they look at the biblical text and consider that it came to us through a variety of sources which were later redacted into what we have today. What I think is interesting about this particular teaching is that it crosses all of those. So in other words, you will find this teaching, this particular concept, this principle, this bedrock principle, the truth that we're covering today, extending into and touching or touched upon by all of the so-called sources within our Pentateuch. I believe that this is a bedrock truth and a revelation of and through the historical Moses. What then is the biblical significance of the name of Moses' eldest son, and what is the principle whereby I will use that to demonstrate today and trace back to Mosaic authority what is that significance, at least based upon strong textual support beginning in Genesis and running all the way through the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I want to make sure that you understand this. This does not mean that the concept or teaching or bedrock principle doesn't extend beyond the Pentateuch. It certainly does. But I want to begin there. And I want to show that this goes back to our earliest sources. So what's a ger in the ancient world? What is a ger? At this point, we know that it was translated as alien and stranger by the same Bible. The same Hebrew phrase, ger nochriah, one translation, Exodus 2:21-22, translates it a stranger in a strange land, which I like the alliteration there. But what about, how do you then look at the same Hebrew 16 chapters later, probably the same translator, and say an alien in a strange land? I mean, why? What? Now, could he imply that those words are the same? Well, if they're the same, pick one. All right. So what is a ger in the ancient world? And further, and more importantly, once we decide what a ger is, you can put a word to it. But the word, I want you to get a picture. When I began studying Hebrew with my teacher, Johnny Powell, some of you know him as Yokanani, he told me, Ross, don't assign a word for a word. Assign a picture. When you read the Hebrew, think of what that is and picture it. Now, within that picture that you now have, you can associate different words. And that's the art of translation. You want to picture what the word means in another language. If I say sus, people say, oh, that's the Hebrew word for horse. It is. But when I read sus, I imagine Black Beauty. That's just my picture. I know there are other color horses. But when I translate it, I would never say a beautiful black horse. Some translators take those liberties. Do you understand the illustration I'm making here? So some people allow that picture to creep into the text. Now, what I'm going to do in this class is we are going to understand what it is that ger means, and I'll paint that picture for you with the differences that come into that because I want you to get a full understanding of it. I want you to see Black Beauty when I say horse, but I also want you to understand the full impact of this concept in this term. Now, we're gonna mainly focus on this subject. The reason I'm looking at this now is because we are doing a study on the historical Moses. And the idea of a ger ties to the historical Moses in that one of his two sons, at least we only know of two sons, but one of his two sons, he names ger, not because the boy is a ger, but because he feels that he, Moses, at one point in his life, is a ger in a foreign land. So, now one other caveat that I'd like to lay out before I go into this is I realize that in the broad Torah faith movement, there is an ongoing debate that was initiated a couple of years ago, actually, on defining and if I may, straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel when it comes to the understanding of the ger. And people got in big fights and broke communities over, are you a ger toshav? Are you ger this? Are you ger this? Is a b'nai Noah ger? Is a ben Noah ger? I'm not entering into that debate. I'm not interested at all and don't know any of those people personally. I understand the complexities of the argument, but I just want you to understand this class, I'm only concerned with what the biblical idea of a ger is. But I had to make that comment because I'm aware on my periphery that argument has been and is still going on somewhat. I am talking biblically. Ger. Ger is translated variously, as we've already witnessed in the two examples that I've covered. It's sometimes translated other than stranger and alien by the use of the word sojourn or sojourner. I like that word. It's a cool word. But what does it mean, right? What is the English trying to convey? What part of the picture in the translator's mind when he sees the Hebrew ger does sojourn mean? It often carries the idea of a temporary dweller. It sometimes carries the idea of a newcomer, an outsider. We might say a greenhorn, someone who is from another place. The idea that all of these seem to bring us to understand is that a ger is a non-native born to a people or a place. A non-native born to a people or place. Notice I said a people or place. Now, I'm going to illustrate that as we work through. So a working definition with a little more meat on it, if you can think about it that way. It's a person or a group who is residing, get this, either temporarily or permanently. You can be a permanent ger. In other words, you're still a non-native born to a people or place, but you're there permanently. You're not just passing through, like the old hymn, I'm just a stranger passing through this world, which in some sense we all are without going too dualistic on you. But the idea is that you're not native, but you can be permanent. You weren't born there. You're not a citizen even in some cases, but you're there. So it's a person or group residing temporarily or permanently within a community and or a place that is not their own. It's not their own. Additionally, biblically speaking, most often these transplanted people are in some way dependent on the goodwill of the host, that is, those who are native born. So they're dependent on the goodwill of the host in order to provide for them or to make it possible and even allow them to acquire the help and sustenance and provision that they need to live. Because they're not native born. They have to be allowed to live and pursue happiness and liberty, right? I threw that in because it's, you figure it out. Okay, now of his stay in Midian, Moses says that Hayiti ba'eretz nochriya, I have been, ger Hayiti ba'eretz nochriya. A ger, I have been in a land that is foreign, or in a foreign land. Moses is not the only person we know from the Pentateuch that claims to be a ger. I want to go through some of these. We'll talk about what it means. I want to paint a picture. Go with me to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. And verse 10. And there was a famine in the land, and Avram went down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, to sojourn there. For the famine was severe in the land. Let me tell you something. One thing that will cause a person to become a ger is they might be driven from their native home or from the place of their residence. In this case, Avram was not even a resident from the place that he was a resident, but he wasn't a native-born resident. So Avram was in some sense already a ger who gers further. I'm using the Hebrew in a bad English way, but you get the point. He's a ger already, and he continues to be a ger, but in another foreign place. This time, he leaves the land that he is in and goes to Egypt. He's driven there by famine. Okay, look at chapter 20 and verse 1. Chapter 20 and verse 1 of Genesis. We want to establish the fact that not just Moses has experienced this idea of being a ger. And Abraham, verse 1 of chapter 20, journeyed from there towards the Negev, or toward the Negev, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. He, if you can allow me to do this with the English and Hebrew, he gered in Gerar. All right, you get that? And that kind of sounds, it's a little bit of a Hebrew alliteration. He was a ger in Gerar. Ger is Gimel Resh, and Gerar is Gimel Resh Resh. So you're a Gerar ger. I don't know that they ever said that. I just think it's cute. Genesis 23 and verse 1. Let's continue with the patriarchs here. 23:1, and Sarah was 127 years old. These were the years of Sarah's life. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Het, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And you remember this back and forth that takes place between the Hittites and Avram, and I think that this is a wonderful story, but it demonstrates that Abraham is in the land of Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And he says to the people of Het, I'm a stranger. Notice in the Hebrew it says, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. A ger, now a toshav. Shav, the root word there means to dwell, to sit or to dwell. So he says, I'm a ger, and one who dwells with you am I. So smoothing that syntax out a little bit, he could say, I'm a ger, and I dwell with you. All right, so we get this idea. I want you to begin to paint the picture. In this particular story, Abraham he ultimately goes on to buy a piece of land. Okay, now look with me to Genesis 35. Genesis 35 and verse 27, 35, 27. And Jacob, came to Isaac his father to Mamre, to the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. Okay? So here we get Jacob coming to the place that we just spoke about, and it's mentioned that he arrives at the place where Abraham and Isaac had gered. They had been a ger there. Ger there. Boy, I'm all over these today. Genesis 47, 1. Genesis 47 and 1. Then Yosef came and told Pharaoh, and said, my father and my brethren, and their flocks, and their herds, and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brothers, 5 men, and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what's your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said moreover to Pharaoh, to sojourn in the land we are come. For your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brethren are come to thee. The land of Mitzrayim, Egypt, is before you. In the best of the land, make your father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell. And if you know any able men among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. Now, this is an interesting story because the children of Jacob, tell Pharaoh, he says, what are you doing here? And they said, look, a famine drove us here. We're refugees. We're seeking to be ger in your land. Now, I want you to notice that Pharaoh doesn't kick them out, right? His policy is open and accepting to those that are from a foreign land. He lets them in. Not only does he let them in, he said, listen, if any of these are skilled at the things that I need, put them in charge. Interesting, right? And this particular thing that I want to stress is that Pharaoh didn't say, I'm sorry, you said you wanted to ger? What does that mean? What do you mean? What's that word mean? He said, oh, I know exactly what your famine was there. You're here because of trying times in your native place, and you've come here. Yeah, the whole land is yours. Yeah, you're welcome here. You're welcome here. Okay, now, here we have Israel in Egypt. Go to Isaiah. Isaiah 52. Isaiah 52. And verse 4. For thus says, Ki כה אמר Adonai Yehovah. For thus says Jehovah, let's see, for thus says Adonai Jehovah, my people went down aforetime, I like that, to Egypt to sojourn there, and Ashur oppressed them without cause. Now, translation's not so great because, it's a little bit confusing, but he's describing two different periods, very clearly in the Hebrew, not clear at all in the English, in any translation. People mess this up all the time and they get confused. What it's saying is that at first, Israel went to sojourn in Egypt, and we know how that turned out. And in the end, Ephes indicates the end. In the end, Ashur has oppressed him. Two different events. So Israel sojourned in Egypt. Now, go back with me to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15 and verse 13. This is God speaking to Avram at the time. And he said to Avram, this is the covenant of the pieces, as it's often called, know surely that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. So this is predictive. It's prophetic in a way. Avram the Ger is told that his seed, his descendants, of which he has none at this point, will be Gerim in a land that doesn't belong to them, right? And this is the key that I want you to begin to see in the painting that is before your ears. You ever heard of a painting before your ears? Not before your eyes. I want the painting before your ears says that a ger is a transplant. A ger is someone who is not native born to a people or a place. It's a broad term. It's very important that we know what it is and what does the Bible tell us we must do when it comes to our relations with these transplants, with these gerim. Because this is big. Let me tell you how big it is. Let me tell you why I want you to be listening closely. More than 50 times the thing that I'm going to cover today shows up in the Pentateuch. Now, I challenge you to find me anything that is mentioned more than 50 times. A concept, a bedrock principle, a truth that crosses all the sources that scholars have claimed exist. And find it for me and feel free to email me that information. This idea that Israel was a ger in the land of Egypt was to be remembered for all times. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 26. Deuteronomy 26. And I want to read verses 1 through 11, Deuteronomy 26. And it shall be, Moses, Deuteronomy 26:1, it shall be when you are come into the land which Jehovah your God gives you for an inheritance, and you do possess it, and do dwell there, that you shall then take of the first of all the fruit of the earth, which you shall bring of your land that Jehovah your God gives you. And notice the stress, this land that God's giving you, land God gives you, land God gives you. Put it in a basket. You shall go to the place which Jehovah your God shall choose to place his name there. And you shall go to the priest that shall be in those days and say to him, I profess this day to Jehovah your God that I am come to the country which Jehovah swore to our fathers to give us. And the priest shall take the basket out of your hand, set it down before the altar of Jehovah your God, and you shall speak and say before Jehovah your God, An Aramaean nomad was my father, and he went down to Egypt, and he sojourned there with a few, and became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And Egypt dealt ill with us, and afflicted us, and laid upon us hard bondage. And when we cried to Jehovah, God of our fathers, Jehovah heard our voice and looked upon our affliction and our labor and our oppression. And Jehovah brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with great terribleness, with signs, with wonders. And he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now behold, I have brought the first fruits of the land which Jehovah has given me. And you shall set it before Jehovah your God, and worship before Jehovah your God. And you shall rejoice in every good thing which Jehovah your God has given you, listen, and your house, you and the Levite, and the stranger that is among you. So it begins to let this principle be known. What is the effect of the cause that you need to know and understand and live by? You are to confess when you bring the bounty of the land. Jehovah gave me this land. This land was given to me by Jehovah. Jehovah gave me this place. The place was given to me by Jehovah. I was a ger in the land of Egypt, and I was treated badly, and God gave me this place, and I'm going to rejoice now. And oh, please, ger, you ger, come celebrate with me. It's a command for inclusivity beyond what is likely to be natural among any given people. It's what it is. Now, the remembrance of their life as a ger, the good and the bad, both examples, found its way into the Hebrew faith, as I said, more than 50 times. Look with me, Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24:14. You shall not oppress a hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of your brethren or of your strangers that are in your land within your gates. At his day you shall give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor and sets his heart upon it, lest he cry against you to Jehovah, and it be a sin in you. That, look, if you have somebody that's working for you, and the Torah wants to make this clear, whether they be native born or a ger, doesn't matter. God forbid that person cries to me. You better treat him right. Don't oppress anyone. Basically, here's what it says, or that is a sin to you. Look at 24:17. You shall not pervert the judgment of the ger, the stranger, or of the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge, but you shall remember that you were a bondman in Egypt, and Jehovah your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. Look, the reason you're commanded to not pervert the judgment of the ger, what does that even mean? Let me give you a little Hebrew here. In the Hebrew, it says literally, don't stretch out the mishpat of the ger. What does that mean? Don't stretch the distance between justice and the ger. Don't make it a long way for a ger. Don't make it a long way for the ger to have to reach for justice. To stretch out. Pervert is sometimes a translation of a Hebrew term that means to make crooked. But in this case, don't stretch it out. Don't delay justice to one who is needy. Verse 18 is the why. Because you shall remember that you were a bondman in Egypt. Don't forget that when you get high and mighty and have your land and all this fruit. When you start raking in the process and you start raking in the profits and your land is fruitful, and let me tell you who better be there right there with you rejoicing. It better be the servant. It better be the ger. You start excluding those who are less fortunate, the outsider, the stranger, the alien. You start pushing them out, honey, you've got problems. Look at Exodus 22. Exodus 22 and verse 20. Exodus 22 and verse 20. You shall neither vex a ger nor oppress him. Why? For you were gers, gerim, in the land of Mitzrayim. Look, don't treat them badly because you were one. 23:9, Exodus 23:9. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, a ger. Why? For you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It says, you know the soul. How many of us understand the soul of the oppressed? This is a challenge for people of all ages. This is why people have used the biblical text to champion some of the most remarkable challenges to governments around the world for and on behalf of oppressed people everywhere and of all shape, creed, color, religion. The Bible is the seed of freedom. All we have to do is allow it to grow. Place it in a nurturing environment. Give it sunlight. Give it breathing room. And give it water to grow. I posted a picture of these beautiful plants outside this building. It takes a little bit of care. You got to plant it just right. Bridget did that. You have to put it in just the right place. Bridget did that too. You have to have the right pot. That was Lyndon. And you have to water it. That was me. I did that. I walk by and I know how much water to give them because people taught me that. But my goal is to make these plants the most beautiful plants on all this street. And let me tell you, nothing is more important to grow than the concepts and the principles of Torah that proclaim liberty and freedom and justice to all. And that's what we're talking about today. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 19. Deuteronomy 10 verse 19. Love, therefore, the ger. Love, therefore, the ger. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear Jehovah your God. And it goes into other things about God. But notice, love the stranger, for you were strangers. Now, let me back up and read verse 16. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no more. For Jehovah your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, mighty and terrible, who favors no person. That means none, and takes no bribe. He executes judgment of the fatherless and widow and loves the stranger, giving him food and raiment. Then it says, love therefore the stranger, for you are strangers. Look, you should love those. God loved you first, and God loves them. Don't ever forget, you mistreat a ger, that's bad. It's one of the most talked about, commanded kindnesses in all the Bible. Deuteronomy 23:7. Deuteronomy 23:7. It's verse 8 in the Hebrew. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were a stranger, a ger in his land. Now, notice that even Egypt, who was the bad guy of the time, right? I mean, the way this is written, we have to assume that this piece of legislation comes shortly after they've left the people dead on the seashore. It's recalling that time frame anyway, at any rate. And the idea is that even an Egyptian is not to be hated. Now, notice it does, in certain cases in the Hebrew Bible, require more time to allow them in. Now, that's important, especially when one begins to think contemporary things. If you have a group which was at some point your enemy, You have to use caution, and that's very important. Don't forget this piece. It says they can come in. A little bit more time. Okay, now go back to Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19. And I can't watch the text, but I know people might try to get ahead of me. I'm doing this in a certain order for a certain reason. So, all right, Leviticus 19, let's look at 33. If a stranger or if a ger gers with you, it says, V'kiya gor itka ger. And if a ger gers with you in your land, don't wrong him. But the stranger that dwells with you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God. Love as yourself. The same treatment is to be extended to the ger as you would yourself. We already read Jehovah loves the stranger, and therefore you love the stranger. It's commanded. This isn't like, we can't explain this away and go, yeah, but you don't know my neighbors. These people are, they're just crazy as hell. I don't want them in. Like, well, I mean, let's think. So you have to read. What does it say? All right, now, look at Leviticus 19:17. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall certainly rebuke your neighbor and not suffer sin on his account. You shall not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Jehovah. Now, it's interesting that when you take these two together, a person in this holiness code in Leviticus 19 could begin by saying, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. You're like, okay, I can do that. I can love my own people, you know. I mean, I can love white people with gray hair and, you know, I got that down. But then it says to love my neighbor as myself. That's a little bit harder. You're like, well, I got to love them as much as I love me. You're like, well, yeah, that's a commandment. And then you say, well, wait a minute. Now it goes further in 33 and 34. If you have a stranger, somebody who is not native born, somebody who is not of your community or your place, you're supposed to love them just like you love yourself too, T-O-O. Now we're getting a little bit harder. I mean, some of these verses we really would just, you know, probably be easier if they weren't in there. Because then we wouldn't have to excuse our bad behaviors and our wickedness, you know. Okay. But love demands action. Go with me to Leviticus 19:10. 19:10. You shall not glean your vineyard, neither shall you gather the single grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the ger. I am Jehovah your God. So don't take everything out of the crop. Leave it for people to come get. Same thing basically, Leviticus 23. Look at Leviticus 23 and verse 22, please. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not altogether remove the corners of your field when you reap it, nor shall you gather any gleaning of the harvest. You shall leave them to the poor and to the stranger, or the ger. I am Jehovah your God. Notice in this holiness code, you have to do this. Love other people. Love people you wouldn't normally love. I don't care. Didn't ask you. Love them anyway. By the way, I am Jehovah your God. Underline, underscore, exclamation point. Okay, look at Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 and verse 19. 24:19. When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, don't go back to fetch it. It will be for the ger, for the fatherless, for the widow, so that Jehovah your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. In other words, if you're greedy, tight-handed, you go back to get the last little stalk, you're not going to be blessed. Because you're depriving people who can't take care of themselves. Again, The Bible has been the seedbed for people of all ages who seek to liberate, who seek justice on behalf of oppressed people. Now, the same rules apply. So you're not just supposed to carte blanche, be sweet and loving to everybody who disregard your rules and laws. The other shoe drops now. You go, well, I'm thinking of modern things that are going on. Well, hold up. Yes, all of that was true, so very true, and by God, we better be careful to execute it right. But this group is responsible. Look with me, Exodus chapter 12. They're allowed to participate, and they are treated the same in this respect. Exodus chapter 12, verse 19, please. 7 days, 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger, a ger, or born in the land, you shall eat nothing leavened in all your habitation. You're like, wait a minute, what? A stranger, a ger, and the Passover? This is not a native born. This is a person of another people, another group, and doing the Passover? Sure. Look at 48, verse 48 and 49. Yeah, they can do it. And when a ger, it says, V'kiyagor itzcha ger, and when a stranger or a ger gers with you, when a stranger shall sojourn with you and will keep the Passover to Jehovah, let all his males be circumcised, then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land. Right? Not in the back seat. For no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. 1 Torah shall be to him that is homeborn and to the stranger that sojourns among you. Same Torah. Whether you're born, native born, or you're not. Now, people, a lot of times in modern Judaism, they say this is the convert. Okay, well, that's, I'll let you decide on that one. This is not talking about a formal conversion process that people went through. If a person is not a native born, but he is dwelling among and moving with and living among the people, is not necessarily his people or his group in origin, but he's part of it, he keeps everything just like they do. He is allowed to do, required to do, and so forth. Look at chapter 20, Exodus 20. I've got a lot of these to run through, but I can do it quickly because I want to make this point. Exodus 20 and verse 10. The seventh day is a Sabbath to Jehovah your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days God created, he rested therefore. Right? Now, the stranger, the ger, Shabbat. A lot of people say, well, technically you don't have to keep the Shabbat because that's for me, because I'm holy and I was specifically chosen. Now, you are holy and chosen to teach other people to keep it, so that's the job. Now, look at chapter 23 and verse 12. Chapter 23 and verse 12. 6 days you shall not do, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, so that your ox and your ass may rest, and the son of your handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. In all things that I've said to you, be mindful of, and make no mention of the name of other gods, and so forth. Notice, again, Shabbat is for the stranger. If you go to Leviticus 16, I'm going to give you a few of these verses and not read them. Leviticus 16 and verse 29, we're dealing with specific legislation that is required of both the stranger as well as the native born. And while we're in Leviticus, if we look at chapter 17, I can do these very quickly. In chapter 17 of Leviticus, notice verse 8, you shall say to them, whatever man there be of the house of Israel or of the Gerim, the strangers who sojourn among you, that offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, it brings it to the door of the tent of meeting. You ever notice that? That strangers also, Gerim, this isn't just Israel. And look, if you don't believe me there, chapter 17, verse 8, verse 10, verse 12, verse 13, verse 15, all say the same thing. Whoever offers this sacrifice, whether a native born or a ger, same rules apply. Chapter 18, verse 26. I love it because sometimes people will say, well, this one law applies for both. That's only in very small situations. That comes from someone who hasn't really studied. Look at 18:26. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger, ger, that sojourns among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done who are before you, and the land is defiled, right? That the land vomit you out also not when you defile it, as it vomited out those nations before you. So whether a person is native born of the people of Israel or a ger, that applies to them too. All right. Now, chapter 20 of Leviticus, verse 2. Chapter 20 and verse 2. You shall say to the children of Israel, whoever he be of the children of Israel, or the Gerim that sojourn in Israel, that gives any of his seed to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. Again, the punishments and the penalties, whether it's a native born or a ger, it applies. Same thing is seen in chapter 22 and verse 18, where it talks about whether a person is of the house of Israel or the strangers, and they sacrifice for all their vows, free will offerings, burnt offerings. All of this deals with strangers or gerim as well as native born. Leviticus, this is a priestly book, by the way. Leviticus 24:16. He who blasphemes the name of Jehovah shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, both the ger and he that is born in the land when he blasphemes the name. And then verse 22 says, you shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for one of your own country, for I am Jehovah your God. Numbers chapter 9 and verse 14 is another one. One law, no matter who. One Torah. And I'm going to give you a few verses. I'm making up time. Numbers chapter 15, verse 14 through 16. Numbers chapter 15, verse 22 through 26. Verses 29 and 30. Did you know in Numbers chapter 19 and verse 10, it talks about the stranger who might be defiled from hauling the ashes of the red heifer? Who would have thought that somebody of ger status might be hauling the ashes of the red heifer? Wouldn't you think that that's reserved for the native born? Numbers is full of these, and there are many, many more. But I want you to go with me to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 16. And I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother. And the gerim, or the stranger, the ger, that is with him, do not respect persons in judgment, but hear the small as well as the great. Don't be afraid of the face of any man, for the judgment is God's, and the cause that is too hard for you, bring it to me and I'll hear it. Look, we have to have a system of justice that extends beyond ethnic, racial, you name it. Justice for all. Leviticus 25 says, liberty to all the inhabitants of the world thereof, the land thereof. Proclaim liberty to all. Again, Deuteronomy 5:14 is the counterpart to Exodus 20, where it talks about that the ger is to rest, and in fact, the whole purpose of Shabbat is so that these people, your servants, your male servants, men servants, your animals can rest. Yes, it's for you too. The Sabbath is for you too. But it is if you're not working and working the people who work for you, you're allowing them some refreshment. Just like when you rejoice for the bounty that God's given you, you better have them in the meeting. So too when it comes time to rest and refresh. We're not allowed to say, you know what, I'm not doing anything today. It's the Shabbat. John, I need you to cut my grass for me. You don't believe in this anyway, right? Okay. Chapter 16, verses 11 and 14 of Deuteronomy talk about the festivals and how this is part of, they're included as well. The ger is included in this. In fact, if we look at Zechariah chapter 14, written in such a way as to describe what we would call the Acharit Hayamim, or the latter days, you would imagine a picture that fits this. And in case that is the case, because you have people from all nations flowing to Jerusalem, they send delegates to represent their nation in order to get rain, and they're there worshiping the Lord God, and they're keeping Sukkot. You say, well, that's a Jewish festival, son. I can't let you keep that with me. It's not for you. It's for us. Better open those tents. Better get ready. Open it up. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 26. Deuteronomy 26, 11. Okay, when you put this, I covered this a minute ago, but I want to stress this. When you put this bounty, the blessing that God has given you, here's what you say again. You have to confess this. You shall set it before Jehovah your God, and worship before Jehovah your God, and you shall rejoice in every good thing which Jehovah your God is giving you in your house, you and the Levite, and the ger that is among you. Then there's a white space, and then notice it says, when you've made an end of tithing all the tithe of the produce in the third year, which is the year of tithing, you've given it to the Levite, the ger, the fatherless, the widow, that they may eat within your gates and be full. Then you shall say before Jehovah your God, I have removed the holy things out of my house, and also I've given them to the Levite, to the ger, to the fatherless, and to the widow, according to all your commandment which you have commanded me. I've not transgressed your commandments, neither have I forgotten them. I've not eaten of it in the morning, in my morning, not in the morning, in my morning, other kind of morning, neither have I consumed any part of it when unclean, and so forth and so on. So he's asking, this person says, look, send a blessing my way, and here's why. He says, I've shared all this with those who couldn't provide for themselves. The Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. Look, I'm just suggesting that quite possibly not a one of us could make this profession. I really don't think we could. Doesn't mean we haven't done good things or helped out as we could and when we could, But you see what I'm trying to stress here. This is a major part of the biblical life. You know, we like to think we're Torah-oriented or we live Torah faith. Well, yeah, you just kind of skin deep. That's about all we do. It's a challenge. Look, if it wasn't a challenge, if God just said, hey, Ross, love yourself, you say, put a check mark, I got that. Hey, Ross, love your family. That's easy. But what if it says, love others? What if it pushes you outside of what is, that's when you're living Torah faith. If you're not doing these things, these hard things, you're not living Torah. Anybody can eat matzah for 7 days. Anybody can avoid leavening for 7 days. Anybody can stop working from Friday evening to Saturday evening. That doesn't make you Torah faithful. Anybody can say, I'm not going to eat pork chops anymore. Anybody can, well, not anybody, not here in the South, but most people can. But the idea is that it's the harder things that Torah faith is really driving us towards. That's where the leather meets the road. Look at Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy 31, and let's look at verse 10. Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the time of the year of release, in the feast of booths, when all Israel is to come to appear before Jehovah your God, in the place which he shall choose, you shall read this Torah before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men, women, children, and your stranger that is within your gates, that they may hear, that they may learn and fear Jehovah your God and observe to do all the words of this Torah, and that their children who've not known anything may hear and learn to fear Jehovah your God as long as you live in the land, whether you go over the Jordan to possess it. Look, I'm talking biblically. I'm talking non-native to the people and place. They're not Israelites. They're invited to listen so that they can learn to guard, to do, to keep. And it's a festival by all, you know, I mean, you can see. Laws throughout the Pentateuch are consistent on several points. Very, very consistent. Don't harass or oppress the outsider, the stranger, the Gerim. That's easy for us to go, yeah, Israel better get on that. Look, we want to be part of this biblical lifestyle. We better do it in Idaho. We better do it in Louisiana, in Michigan, in California, in Nevada, and Arizona, and Florida, and Georgia, Tennessee. I mean, you get it. It's not just, you know what, these people in the Bible better do better. See, we want to latch on to and try to say we live according to these rules, but we like to pick the easy ones to choose. I mean, that's just human nature. These Gerim are not to be harassed or oppressed. They're to be loved and embraced, get this, and treated as native born. Subjected to the same rules and laws, important part of this, that's the other shoe, as every native born. They're entitled to the same blessings, but they're also held to account and able to receive without impartiality the same curses too, the same punishments, the same consequences, whether they be good or bad. Look, everyone who is part of this biblically defined nation gets to participate. Now, there is a curse of the law in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 13 and verse 43 through 44, and it tells what happens in regards to the Gerim if you don't do this. They're going to go higher and higher and rise above you in your own place. Let that sink in for a minute. Where their rights, their blessings are really what's important, and yours, a native born, are not. But I'm sure you can't make a connection with that. The patriarchs experienced life as a ger. Moses did as well. Named his son Gershom. I was a stranger there. The proper treatment of and the acceptance of is one of the most emphasized parts of the Torah. 52 times it talks about don't oppress, don't vex, don't this, don't that. You better love, you better not, you better do this, you better don't. 52 times. You're required biblically to confess to Jehovah that you got this right. That's one of the things that you have to confess to God is, I didn't mess this up. I treated the ger right. Now, the way we can get around this, I'll throw this out there for everybody who wants a loophole, is we just be real narrow with our definition of ger. We just say, well, technically, a ger is only, this group. And you go, well, what if somebody's not native born and they're, no. That's too broad. That's for Israel. That's for ancient Israel. For us, it just means somebody from the neighboring town. You be very narrow. It's like saying, love your neighbor as yourself, and you go, I do love my neighbor. Well, what about this guy? Well, he doesn't live by me. How wide or narrow do we interpret these texts? Are we looking for the easiest way? You get what you pay for. You get out of it what you invest in it. I'm saying, challenging to myself, let's be careful how we think about things around us, at least for those of us who claim to live our lives according to Scripture. Let me tell you something. If we talk about those who live in the land, look at Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 and 33. 25:33. If a man, wait a minute, is that right? Let's see, 25:33. Hold up one second. I might have a difference in the verses. 25. I'm looking for the passage that says, you are a stranger living among me, where God tells Israel that they, 25:35 maybe. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to look for this. So you just hold tight. 25:35. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain, you shall support. All right, somebody else can help me. I'm on a roll. But the idea is that in Leviticus, I have in my notes 25:33, where God says to Israel that you are sojourners here with me, meaning, implying that they are in the land that He gave to their fathers, but it is that they are there and they are strangers. They remain, even though the land is given to them, they remain there under that particular category. Look, in some ways, all of us all of us are dwelling in a place not ours. Now, I'm not talking dualism here. What I'm talking about is, in a way, we've been temporarily granted status to live here. In a broad sense, follow my point, we should therefore live our lives in such a way that we are good stewards in this sense, that we are living our life in such a way that we are setting a good example and so forth. We are dwelling in a place not ours, and by that I mean, for the heavens belong to God, and the throne, the earth is His footstool. In that sense, we are our brother's keeper, responsible for the way that we treat one another. There's one God over all of us, and there's one law for all. The tough thing is the tough parts of the law. Those are the pieces that we need to work on, that we need to strive to work for, and that we need to look for ways to interpret in such a way that the most people get the most help. The least we can do is love one another. But how does the Torah define love? This next week, we're going to talk about the Torah's view on love. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Have a beautiful week.